Good evening. Well, no, it's really deep morning for me back in the States. Could I get you all to move forward? We have an abbreviated session. Two of our speakers are caught in the United States. They never left. They missed a connection and no way to make it up. So there'll be two speakers, and we'll make the presentations as they were designed to be. We'll have an extended discussion session if you prefer. Okay, the panel today is parents, peers, and policy. I'm Travis Hirschi. I'm the organizer of the panel. These are my students. The people who were not my students didn't make it. It has been some time since I sat in or participated in a session at a conference, but I remember the first session I attended. I was walking the halls of a meeting of the American Society of Criminology in Tucson, Arizona, which is now my hometown. Seeing a session about to get underway, I took a seat at the back. I don't remember the topic, but the rest I remember quite well. The first speaker gave his talk and sat down. The second speaker got up and said, "That was the dumbest talk I've ever heard." He gave examples to prove his judgment. The third speaker said, "I didn't see much difference between the first and the second speaker, at least in the quality of what they had to say." And he also gave examples to prove his point. The third speaker said, "I didn't see much of any differences between the quality of the first two." The discussion which we had in those days began by declaring a three-way tie. If memory serves, the poor chair, presumably responsible for assembling such an array of talent, suggested they find a beer somewhere and talk things over where they wouldn't be in front of an audience. Well, we have evolved. The Wild West has been settled. Groups of like-minded scholars can now be found, although they're hard to assemble. Carefully crafted arguments have replaced war stories and anecdotes. Session organizers can relax. Audiences need not fear embarrassment. Sometimes I miss the bad old days. Our speakers, we now have two, are, as listed on the program, Barbara Costello of the University of Rhode Island, sociologist, speaking on peers in crime, a control theory perspective. She will be followed by Chester Britt from Iowa State University, where he's chair of the department. He will speak on implications of control theory for crime policy and prevention. I'll turn the mic over to Barbara, and enjoy.
Okay. Thanks, Travis. I'm really happy to be here today. This is a little loud for my naturally loud voice. So today I'd like to tell you about a couple of research projects that I've been participating in recently. The first is based on a book that I've just published with my colleague Trina Hope from the University of Oklahoma. And the second is a follow-up study that I've conducted with my colleague Christine Zozula at the University of Rhode Island. The four questions that I'd like to address today very briefly are, first of all, what are the mechanisms of peer influence toward deviance? Second, how common is positive peer influence, which is something that criminologists have not spent very much time talking about, and what mechanisms are involved in that type of peer influence? Third, can control theory variables explain positive peer influence? And fourth, what motivates youth to try to influence their friends either toward or away from deviance, and what does that tell us about the nature of crime? So as you know, sociologists studying peers and delinquency have typically operated from a cultural deviance or social learning theory perspective, so the work of Sutherland and Akers in particular. And these theories tend to assume that learning is required for crime to occur, so learning deviant norms and values supportive of criminal behavior are necessary for crime to occur. So in the view of these theorists, crime and what I'm calling non-crime, crime and conformity, are essentially equally social behaviors, right? Groups can be organized either for or against criminal behavior, as Sutherland put it, and there isn't really a distinction made between the type of behavior. In contrast, control theorists, Hirschi and Gottfriedson and Hirschi, have tended to deny a causal impact of peers on delinquency and argue instead that self-selection explains the delinquency-peer delinquency connection. So control theories assume that deviance comes naturally in the absence of social ties, and in this view then, crime is asocial. It's a natural outcome of human nature. It provides quick and easy benefits and so on, and social bonds always deter deviance. Okay, and that's been kind of a controversial claim given the arguments that social learning theories make. So as Mark Warr noted in his book, Companions in Crime, simply the correlation between peer deviance and the individual's deviance doesn't tell us anything about the process or mechanisms of influence. So despite decades of research, and most currently there's been a lot of research using social network analysis, so it's very methodologically sophisticated, but we still know very little about those actual mechanisms or processes of peer influence. So most research suggests that about half of the effect is explainable with self-selection. And then typically researchers have simply assumed that any remaining effect of peer deviance on deviance is due to learning, right? So often studies like this don't even measure the learning process or even norms and values supportive of crime. It's just sort of assumed that whatever's left over after self-selection is explainable with learning processes. So in my book with Trina Hope, we simply asked people to tell us what happens when they're with their peers, right? And that's something that, from what we can tell, nobody's really done before in criminology. Okay. The other major focus of the book is looking at positive peer influence. So I have a couple of quotes here from psychologists who have studied children's friendships and the nature of children's friendships. And they're approaching this issue from a very different perspective, looking at peers as something that contribute to people's well-being, right? And this is something that criminologists have almost completely ignored. Right? One major exception to this is Sampson and Laub's work, where they look at the effect of conforming wives on previously delinquent husbands' behavior and find that there is this really direct controlling effect of wives on husbands, but there's been essentially no attention paid to the possibility that peers can have a positive influence on each other's behavior in a very direct way, right? So in addition to the attachment to peers kinds of things that Travis talked about in causes of delinquency. So another way of looking at this issue is to say that any correlation between delinquent friends and delinquency is also necessarily a correlation between conforming friends and conformity, which is completely consistent with control theory. So another focus of the book is to look at the types and mechanisms of positive peer influence. So even though we only have 2 speakers today, I planned the talk to be about 15 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep it pretty short. I've left out most of the details of the methodology of both studies that I'm going to talk about today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have about that later on. We have 2 sources of data. The first source of data are just papers I asked students to write for me in the fall of 2009 semester. These were students in an intro sociology course, and another larger data set of a survey of URI students and a larger sample of students from the University of Oklahoma. And so, of course, it's a convenient sample. We're not claiming that our results are representative of any larger population, but given that the study is, in some sense exploratory, we thought it was sort of a handy sample to use. Okay. So I've summarized what we found in terms of the qualitative results for the most common types of negative and positive influence attempts. So the negative influence is the pro-deviant, right, pro-criminal behavior, and the positive influence could be either trying to keep someone from committing deviant behavior or trying to get somebody to do something pro-social. So those were kind of two different things. I've just summarized the most common types of influence here, and one incident could be coded as including more than one type of influence, so that's why the percentages don't total to 100. I've left some stuff off here for the sake of brevity. So what we found is that there's a lot of what we call simple opportunity effects. So what I've called here a simple offer or invitation was the most common type of pro-deviant influence that we found in our data. This is something like, hey, Chet, I have some marijuana, let's go smoke it. Chet says, okay. Right, so I've had an effect on Chet's behavior because I've caused him to do something that he probably wouldn't have done without the invitation. But it's very, I think of it as being a very trivial type of peer influence, and so this is something that that we haven't spent too much time talking about in terms of explaining peer influence. We found something very similar in terms of positive influence on the right side of the screen, where positive behavioral effects are often the result of a simple offer or invitation, and that might include something like, hey, I know you're having a hard time in this class. Do you want to come and study with me and a group of friends, right? That would be an example of trying to influence somebody to do something that's sort of pro-social, or it could be, hey, if you want to go to the party, I'll go with you and drive so that you don't have to worry about drinking. That would be another example that we found in our data of a simple offer. In terms of coercion, this most often for negative influence took the form of ridicule, right, which Mark Ward talks about quite a bit in his book as being a possible mechanism of deviant behavior. So we saw a lot of, I'll read you one example from the book. This is a guy who's driving on a divided highway and his friends wanted him to turn around. And he says, I was scared because not only was it illegal to make the U-turn, but also there were cars traveling 50 miles per hour. They kept yelling at me saying, you're such a pussy, you don't have any balls, grow up and just turn here. So that kind of ridicule was fairly common, especially among males in our sample. It was the most common type of a coercive influence attempt. So this is peer pressure. Right? It's interesting that when you look at the literature, neither control theorists nor social learning theorists have really paid any serious attention to what I think the average person thinks of as peer pressure. And we were surprised at how much of it we found in the data in both a positive and kind of negative direction. An example of coercive positive influence would be something like physically breaking up a fight, or we had cases of people wrestling somebody's car keys away when they were too drunk to drive. And then the third most common type of both negative and positive influence that we uncovered was what I call here minimizing negative consequences of a deviant behavior on the left side of the screen. On the right side of the screen, maximizing the negative consequences of deviant behavior. It could also be maximizing positive consequences of a pro-social behavior. So this was the, don't worry, I do this all the time, you won't get caught kind of a thing, right, in terms of negative influence. In terms of positive influence, it could be something like, you would be much better off if you went to class, because if you don't, you might flunk out of school, that kind of thing. So those were the three most common types of both negative and positive influence that we found. The fourth listed on under negative influence is what I've called the benefit of onlookers. So this was something that was really interesting because I've never seen anyone talk about this in the literature on peer influence before. And these were cases where, in terms of the negative influence, where peers got one of their peers to do something deviant or dangerous, in some cases for their own amusement. So there was one example that we report in the book where some friends found out that one friend, he told them that he had never been drunk enough to, in his words, puke. So his friends thought it would be really funny to see if they could get him drunk enough to puke. So they kept, in their words, making him drink more, and then he didn't end up throwing up. But it was something that they did that was really pretty dangerous for the person involved, I think, the way they described the situation. But they thought it was funny. Right, so that was something that actually led to the follow-up study that I want to talk about later on, which is looking at the motives or motivations for peers to try to influence each other's behavior in both a negative and positive direction. So I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So what we concluded looking at the pro-deviant peer influences, contrary to what control theories have typically said, there is a causal effect of peers on each other's delinquency. However, a lot of that causal effect is it's pretty simple, right? It's pretty ordinary. It's a lot of its opportunity. And contrary to social learning theories, there's very little evidence that this kind of influence is happening through teaching norms conducive to deviant behavior. So we were really surprised at how few references we saw in all of our data to pro-deviant peer influence in which moral concerns were mentioned at all. So they're not talking about values. They're talking about you won't get caught or don't be a baby, right? These kinds of things, but they're not really, we didn't find much at all about, there's nothing wrong with it, everybody does it, that kind of thing. We just didn't find it. Consistent with opportunity-based theories, we were finding that a lot of peer influence is fairly trivial, right? Just simply the result of presenting opportunities. And then, as I mentioned, we were left with this unanswered question of what are the motives for peer influence that I'll come back to in a minute. In terms of the qualitative analysis of positive peer influence, first of all, it was just really striking how much of this we found. And it was striking because criminologists have spent so little time looking at this. In the opening remarks this morning, I think there were at least 3 different references to the possibility that peers can have a positive influence on behavior. Minister Johansson mentioned that sometimes peers can sort of change the trajectory, although he didn't use that word, change the trajectory of somebody who's sort of headed in a delinquent or criminal direction. McCord's research was mentioned as well, and Professor Whittam talked about social support as a protective factor. So we've really not spent much time at all thinking about the possibility that friends can actually have a positive influence on each other's behavior, and it happens all the time. So I think it's something that we really should be studying. As I mentioned, we saw very little discussion of moral issues. A lot more discussion of getting caught, whether or not you would get caught, that sort of thing. And then consistent with control theories, we're finding that social ties can be a source of conformity, even when those ties are ties to peers rather than parents or teachers and so on. And I'll come back to the last question in a minute again. So to very briefly talk about the quantitative analyses that we did, we looked only at positive peer influence in this data, and we were hypothesizing that respondents with higher levels of social and self-control would be more likely to try to influence their friends toward conformity, and that those influence attempts would be more likely to be successful. So, making the argument that if higher levels of social and self-control are negatively correlated with deviance and delinquency, they should also be correlated in a similar way with trying to influence one's friends. And then we also expected, just due to an opportunity effect, that more deviant respondents will experience more positive influence attempts. So it's an opportunity effect in the sense that if you don't have any friends who drink alcohol, you don't ever have the opportunity to stop them from driving drunk because they don't drink, right? So we had to factor that in as part of our expectation of our results. And the key findings, probably the most interesting and perhaps the most robust relationship in our data was that the respondents who were the most deviant and who had the most deviant friends, because we did find this really strong correlation between the individual's deviance and their friends' deviance, they were the most likely to experience the most pro-conforming influence from their friends. Right? Even though, again, their friends were deviant. So it's a really counterintuitive finding, and the kind of thing that on more than one occasion I had somebody say, you must have misstated this, right? That you meant that the other way. I said, no, actually. So the most deviant respondents are the most likely to experience pro-conforming influence from their friends. So this suggests to us that people who are engaging in deviant behavior know that they shouldn't be doing it, right? Which is something that control theorists have argued for a long time. So these results are really consistent, again, with opportunity-based theories like routine activities theory. And we argue that these results are really damaging to learning theories that rely on normative, the process of normative transmission to explain peer influence. Okay. We found that our measures of social and self-control variables were really inconsistently related to being the target of pro-social influence attempts or of trying to control other people's behavior. So we looked at that in both ways. Some were and some weren't. We did find that control theory measures were pretty consistently positively related to the success of both types of influence attempts. So we asked respondents both about how frequently they've tried to influence others or the other way around, and also how successful those attempts were. So those measures did predict the success of peer influence, which suggests that the stronger our social bonds, the higher our level of self-control, the more likely we are to be influenced by others' direct attempts at controlling our behavior. Okay, so moving on to really briefly talk about the follow-up study. As I mentioned, we were left with this question, looking at the results, especially for the negative peer influence that seemed to be motivated by a desire for amusement on the part of the people doing the influencing, and we thought it would be interesting to look at this more systematically, which was not something that we asked our respondents in the first study. So again, we have a convenient sample of college students. And we have qualitative data. We just asked students to write about cases where they tried to influence their friends either toward or away from deviance, and then we asked them why they did it in a really explicit way. So we tried to code these data by the motive of the influence and whether the motive was appeared to be selfish or altruistic or both or neither in some cases. And we argued that for learning theories, again, both crime and non-crime are equally social behaviors, right? Groups can be organized one way or the other. So we argue there should be no difference in motives for peer influence toward deviance or toward conformity. In contrast, for control theories, because control theories argue that crime is essentially the result of self-interest, then we thought that deviance should also be more likely to be motivated by self-interest than peer influence toward conformity would be. Okay, and I couldn't resist giving you this example. This first example of what we coded as a selfish motivation is not the best example of a deviant behavior, but it was too funny not to share with you. So one respondent wrote, "There was no real reason to do what I did. The majority of it was just that I knew I could easily manipulate him and have him do something for my enjoyment. I believe it was all just for enjoyment." So this is a student who convinced his friend to suction his face with a plunger and later revealed to him that the plunger was recently used to unclog a toilet. Right, so, and the example of altruistic motivation here is somebody who was trying to get his friends to quit smoking so that they wouldn't get lung cancer, right? So you could make arguments about whether that's truly altruistic or not. I'm not going to do that now. It's on the face of it, it appears to be more altruistic than selfish. So here what we've done is I've showed you the results when we coded them using the motive as the unit of analysis. So some of these influence attempts had both what we called altruistic and selfish motives. So it could be something like, an example of one that could include both altruistic and selfish motivations would be, well, I really wanted to go to this party, but I didn't have anyone to go with me, so I bugged Chet until I finally got him to agree to go. So that's the selfish part. And then the respondent might have also said, well, and I thought he would have a really good time too. So that in our coding would be a more altruistic motive. I know he's going to have fun, but the selfish part is I wanted him to come with me. So we found these really clear differences. And again, this is a question that we don't think anyone has ever asked. So we're always looking at what is the outcome of peer influence, and we haven't really thought about, well, what causes peer influence? Why are peers trying to get each other to do whatever it is that they're trying to get each other to do? And so 83% of the reported motives for positive influence were altruistic as compared to 12% that were selfish. And in contrast, when the behavior in question was deviant, right, what we call negative influence attempts, 36% of them were altruistic, and 53% of them were selfish. So really clear differences between those. So to summarize, what we're seeing is, despite the fact that a lot of literature sort of assumes that learning processes are involved when there is a causal effect of peers on peer deviance, we found very little evidence to suggest that, that's happening, at least in the types of situational influence that we were looking at in our data. So we saw very little reference to moral concerns, the people with the most deviant people with the most deviant friends were the most likely to experience positive peer influence. So this is, again, suggesting that people who are engaging in deviant behavior know that they shouldn't be doing it, right? So it doesn't really support this idea that norms supportive of the behavior are responsible for the behavior. And then both the mechanisms and motivations for peer influence that we uncovered in our data are more consistent with control and opportunity theories than they are with learning theory. We're finding huge opportunity effects with the causal effect of deviant friends on deviance. The motives that we're seeing are really clearly different, right? The motives the motives for peer influence toward deviant behavior are much more likely to be selfish, and this is really consistent with the control theory view of deviance as motivated by selfish concerns, and as the view of deviant behavior as being fundamentally different from conforming behavior. Thank you. It's all yours, Chet.
Are you going to be affected in your discussion by the absence of the other two people? A little.
I'll make a couple comments about it.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. Listening to Barbara, I was impressed by the difference between studies of peer effects and family effects. When we talk about the family, we can talk about marriage, how long they've been married, whether they're divorced, talk about the number of children, and on, differences from one family to another. With peers, we don't have any of these kind of hooks to hang our discussion on. So we have to turn to guessing what the theories say peer effects are like, or actually looking at interactions among peers, as Barbara has done. And I think she has made an important advance in telling us what actually goes on there, as opposed to inferring what goes on there from theories. For example, the learning theory has always suggested to me that the gang gets together and plots a complicated bank robbery or whatever, and you just don't see that in actual interactions of peers. Even calling them peers kind of strips away all of the usual hooks for discussion. They're not friends, they're not relatives, they are just people of essentially the same age, and therefore you don't have any of the standard differences to talk about. For example, in family life, one of the great predictors of delinquency in families is the number of children, and we don't really know how to explain it. The more children a family has, whether it's a single mother or a pair of parents, the more children, the more likely each of them is to be delinquent. Now, there are a lot of explanations. One is, well, it should be easier to supervise a whole bunch, or you can have them supervise each other. Another possibility that has not been explored is that siblings are like peers. They somehow conspire together or influence each other toward delinquency. Now, I came from a large family, and it didn't work that way. Of course, they were females, sisters, and what they did was rat on me to my parents, which means that they exercise control, and therefore there should, in that model, there should be less delinquency, the more children, because they can report. If you don't report, they will report to you. Well, on it goes. I think she has made important advances to clarifying the issue of peer influence on delinquency, a black box that we have talked about and and discussed endlessly without making much progress. Our next speaker, Chester Britt, is going to talk about policy implications of these topics. He is somewhat restricted by the absence of our other two speakers, because he was going to include them to some extent in his discussion. But I'm sure he will manage with what we know and what we've heard. And I'll turn the floor over to him now. Chester Britt.
Right, well, good morning. Thank you all for coming. So last week I received a fairly panicked email from Alex Piquero saying, I've got 27 slides, there's no way I'll be able to finish my talk in 15 minutes. And Matt DeLisi's got an office that's exactly one floor above mine at Iowa State University, and Matt had 20 some odd slides that he was going to present. I thought, okay, I'm going 4th out of 4 presenters. I'll be lucky if I get 7 minutes at the end of the session. And so Alex and Matt very graciously opened up the time slot so that Barbara and I could both present our work and not be constrained by time. So that helps. And while I was expecting Matt and Alex to have both presented before mine, there'll be one little spot in here where I can make some references to what I know were going to be part of their comments, so that it shouldn't be too disruptive. But anyway, so to start to talk about the policy implications of control theory, I thought it might be interesting to go back 30 some odd years and to make brief reference to the National Academy of Sciences report on criminal careers, and that it was largely an atheoretical work, very data-driven, lots and lots of discussion on the correlates of crime, delinquency, criminal behavior, and patterns of criminal career. In the last 20 to 30 years, as there have been sort of an increasing number of prospective longitudinal studies that have looked at correlates of crime over some period of time, be it a relatively 3 to 5 year window, or those that have now studied or continue to follow the participants for onwards of 20 to 30 years, or the Cambridge study even now that has participants that are in their 60s and above. So we have, from that sort of large volume of work, considerable information about risk and protective factors. Right? What are those correlates of crime, delinquency, deviance at different points in the life course? And then more recently, we have some criminologists making use of what I'll call large as opposed to big data to analyze various kinds of crime patterns. For those wondering, I have colleagues who work with millions of records for thousands of variables. I would call that big data. Most criminologists might have records on a few hundred or a few thousands of individuals for several hundred, perhaps 1,000 or 2 variables, but a much smaller kind of scale. But again, we have sort of an increasing body of empirical work that can point to different indicators, different measures that correlate with crime and delinquency. So the question is, why bother with theory, especially as we start to think about policy? And part of it comes back to a comment Travis just made a moment ago, that we have this accumulation of facts, right? We can look at patterns, we can describe patterns, but we're still left with something of a black box. Right? We don't know why something is correlated with something else. We can speculate endlessly on it. There might be 2 different mechanisms to explain it. There might be 10 different mechanisms to explain the relationship. So theory gives us a tool to try to make sense of those different kinds of findings and relationships. And then more specifically in the context of thinking about policy and testing different pieces of theory in the real world, Robert Sampson and some colleagues published a paper in Criminology and Public Policy a couple of years ago that went into the inner workings of program evaluations to try to make sense of the different kinds of work. And one of the comments that they make is that program evaluations can tell us, what worked, right? Did a particular program work? Was it effective at reducing delinquency, criminal behavior, drug use, or something else? But it never quite gets to the point of telling us, well, what will work, right? What if we raise something to scale? What will that same thing work? And so they highlight that there are really 3 key components to trying to raise the bar from a program evaluation to thinking about policy, a somewhat larger scale effort to change trends, change large scale patterns of behavior. And the first of these is to really understand what the causal mechanism is at work. Right, and so this is, again, the sort of key role that theory plays. And in a nod to one of our Stockholm Prize winners, way back when, Hirschi and Selvin, made reference to the fact that, the primary purpose to delinquency research was to sort out what the causal mechanism was at play. And then, secondly, Sampson et al. Make reference to, the question about whether the treatment effects are homogeneous or heterogeneous, right? We know now there's ample evidence that shows that oftentimes treatment effects are not homogeneous, that different individuals will respond to exactly the same conditions in quite different ways. And so then the question is, why does that happen? And can we understand that and try to circumvent those challenges in some other way? And then finally, are the findings context dependent? Right. And I thought it was fairly interesting that in the opening session this morning, we had a brief exchange between Travis and Kathy Whittam, on a particular issue, and part of it was Travis taking the sociologist's 10,000-foot level, and Kathy Whittam taking the psychologist's view that was in the weeds and trying to understand every little nuance. But it struck me that the exchange was really one of understanding the causal mechanism. And so we have Travis talking about what's the principle, what's the thing that explains the relationship between, say, families and delinquency or schools and delinquency. And then have Kathy Whittam trying to understand, well, how does context, specifically in the form of neighborhood, influence all of the different kinds of effects that we find. So 2 very important issues, but at slightly different levels or purposes to try to understand what we're doing. Okay, so theory is important, but why control theory? And I think, it's relatively safe to say that control theory, sort of writ large, not any specific flavor of control theory, but control theory writ large is probably more consistent with the accumulated knowledge that we have on all those risk and protective factors that are fairly well documented at this point in time. I think it's also safe to say that it's the dominant approach in the field. And that many of the other sort of new theories, to the extent that they're new, sort of more integrated theories that people have been proposing over the last decade or so, oftentimes incorporate key components, key pieces of control theory. Right, so that now most integrated theories of crime will include a piece that makes explicit reference to self-control. Right, 20 years ago, the gist of the field was to attack anything that said self-control, and now it's a sort of key component to virtually every theoretical approach in the field. So I think that sort of accommodation by other theories sort of attests to the sort of power that control theory has in the field at large. And then thirdly, I mean, Travis is one of the winners of this year's Stockholm Prize. So I'm not going to stand up here and talk about cultural deviance theory. So, and so just to kind of set the stage for the rest of the talk, thought it might be helpful to sketch out control theory. Again, a very broad view of control theory, not just on self-control or the social bond, but to somehow capture, represent all of the various pieces, and to make brief reference to assumptions, sources of control, and the like. And really the sort of key assumption in any flavor of control theory is really something that goes back to the classical school, right? That individuals will act in a way that is perceived to be in their self-interest at that moment in time. Doesn't imply that individuals are rational, that they're working with full information, or that they have perfect time horizons and they can understand all of the different consequences, just that at some moment in time, something sounds like a good idea, right? Barb asked me if I want to go get high, and at that moment in time, if I'm thinking that sounds like a good idea, I might be more amenable to her suggestion. So again, but the idea is that behavior is really something that's a choice, right? It's not something that individuals are pushed into or pulled into, that the individual has agency and makes a decision, however well or ill-informed, about that behavior. And at the societal level, really is the idea that there is a sort of a common value system that represents sort of the goals, purposes of that society. And the society can, through various mechanisms of control, change the perceptions of whether or not something is in one's self-interest, right? And so the sources of control, right, if we think about it strictly in internal forms, right? We have things like self-control, perhaps morality, impulsiveness, something that resides within the individual and becomes a way to self-regulate one's behavior. It's a form of control. External forms of control, it would make reference to all those political, social, legal, cultural institutions that are external to the individual but still provide some mechanism of control. Context of much of what will be talked about at this conference, focuses on peers and family, right? Two sources of control. Talk about the school system and the kinds of influence that teachers also may or may not have on their students. And then, at the same time, we could talk about internal controls and external controls. In many ways, the two are probably more appropriately thought of as being blended. That if we think about the social bond that Travis described in Causes of Delinquency, it's really a combination of the family, the school, one's peers, having an influence on the individual, but it's something that's internalized by the individual. Wickstrom's work on morality and delinquency, operates in much the same way. That while the initial source might be external, it's something that the individual ultimately internalizes that regulates their behavior. And then finally, make a distinction between formal and informal forms of social control, right? Formal social control typically referring to the legal system, the criminal justice system, and informal social control being all of those other kinds of institutions that have the goal or hope to regulate individuals' behaviors. And by and large, social control theory or control theory, is much more interested in the impact of informal controls rather than formal controls. So turning to issues of policy, right? So one of the I don't know if irritation is quite the right word or not, but one of the pieces that's oftentimes missing from discussions of control theory are the policy implications. And one has to look long and hard to find fairly specific links to connect control theory to policy of one form or another. But there is this paper that came out about 20 years ago by Michael Gottfredson and Travis Hirschi that makes a distinction between controlling criminals, right, the individuals who commit crimes, and then controlling crime, right, trying to change the opportunity structure or the likelihood that different kinds of events can take place. And so they proposed 8 different rules for thinking about how control theory relates to controlling crime and criminals. And I won't walk through each one of these other than to sort of note that the first several are fairly negative about the views that the behavior of adults can be changed in any sort of positive way. That may be true, it may not be true, but it's a fairly less than hopeful outlook for modifying adult behavior. And that there's also skepticism expressed about the influence of the legal system, right, be it with adults or the legal system in general. And I think that healthy skepticism of the justice system sort of runs throughout all versions of control theory. But the more positive aspects of control theory and its links to policy come in the last couple of items on their list, and one is their encouragement to support programs designed to provide early education and effective childcare, and then to support policies that promote and facilitate two-parent families or families that just to increase the number of caregivers relative to the number of children. I think something that Travis just made reference to about 2 minutes before I started talking. And so again, policies that focus on early childhood, adolescent development, and family structure and the influence that families have on behavior. And so when we look at it, sort of a broad swath of program evaluations on these different pieces, what Alex was supposed to have talked about this morning, and I believe his presentation will get posted on the conference's website, are related to the first 2 items. He has 2 meta-analyses that will be, I think, in the next issue of the Journal of Experimental Criminology. One looking at programs that are targeting the development of self-control among children and youth and young adults. The other at parent education programs and the effects that those have on delinquent and criminal behavior. And obviously, with his 27 slides, there's a lot of nuance that I can't give you in a sentence other than to say that the punchline from both of those meta-analyses was that there was a lot of promise to both parent education programs and programs aimed at increasing self-control for children and youth. We have also less attention in criminology, and as Barb made reference to a short time ago, much more attention in psychology to programs that are aimed at fostering positive peer relationships for all of the reasons that Barb made reference to. And then the last item, is that we have sort of increased sensitivity to treatment heterogeneity, especially in the context of how biosocial approaches to criminology begin to tie into our understanding of heterogeneity in those treatment effects. And so part of what Matt was going to discuss was the link between sort of biosocial approaches to understanding crime and delinquency, and how biosocial approaches, by and large, were fairly compatible with control theory, but particularly the self-control theory approach to understanding crime. But there is I believe in the next issue of Criminology and Public Policy, there will be a series of papers out that talk more specifically about biosocial links to understanding policy implications of ways to control crime and try to prevent crime. So it's something that the field has started to pay more attention to and likely see quite a bit more in the years ahead. And so coming into the symposium on the assumption that all of my prior presenters would have talked about peers and parents and families and self-control, thought, okay, the last thing the audience would want to hear is sort of a rehash of everything that everyone else had said. So I went in a slightly different direction, but it will actually get us back to the same place. But it might seem an odd example for some folks in the room. We thought that you could take control theory and think about how it applies to gun violence in the United States. And all of this was done prior to the events in Orlando, Florida on Saturday, making some of this a little odd, but not at all inconsistent with what we know at this point in time happened on Saturday. So, and for the non-Americans in the audience, by way of context, we have in the U.S., and depending on who estimates the number or the source of estimates, there are somewhere around 300 to 350 million guns, be they handguns, rifles of whatever sort, that are owned by private citizens in the U.S. 300 would be a very conservative, low estimate. The more realistic estimate is probably closer to 350 million guns, meaning that if they were so dispersed, every single person in the U.S. could have their own gun. It's obviously not distributed in that way, but it sort of gives you a flavor for how many guns there are in the United States. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, many cultural, many historical, constitutional protections, and so that's not likely to change, right? So calls for outright abandonment or confiscation of guns is something that's just flat out not an option in the United States. And so we have to live with the situation that we have millions and millions of guns and widely prevalent gun ownership. And in that context, many, many opportunities for crimes involving guns. And so typical calls for addressing gun violence, many of these I'm sympathetic to, but the first argument that we often hear are tougher penalties for individuals who have been convicted of gun crimes, right? So somebody who's caught, say, in possession of a firearm while committing some other crime, will perhaps get an add-on of 2 years, 5 years, depends on where it happened, whether it was a state crime or a federal crime, sort of the length of the added severity. But anytime there's a fairly high-profile gun crime, oftentimes the politicians will say, well, we need to toughen penalties on people who commit gun crimes. There will be calls oftentimes after a high-profile event for banning specific types of firearms. Sometimes for universal registration of firearms, and then universal background checks on individuals at the time of a purchase of a firearm. Yes, I know some people in the audience might think, you mean there aren't universal background checks of people who buy firearms? And the answer is no, that if I wanted to sell a gun to Barb, who's my friend, I could hand Barb the gun, and then she could give me cash, check, whatever she wanted to. Private exchanges don't require that. Private gun shows don't require background checks and the like. If you went to a store that was in business to sell guns, they're required to do a background check. So while the distinction might not make sense to some of you, it's the world that we live in. Okay, so then the question is, does it make any difference? And the short answer, not optimistic, is not really, right? And we could look at a substantial body of research that's shown over and over and over again that tougher penalties don't affect crime. Right? And that holds true for gun crimes, that really are no no different. There have been short periods of time when certain weapons have been banned in the U.S., sometimes in cities. So Chicago had a decades-long ban on selling guns within the city of Chicago. And you might be thinking, well, Chicago has a really horrible homicide rate that oftentimes involves guns. Right, so it's very easy for residents of Chicago to drive outside of Chicago, buy a gun, and bring it home. Just within the city of Chicago, gun dealers were not allowed to set up shop. The gun ban had no effect empirically, and then the U.S. Supreme Court shot down that law back in 2010 in a fairly high-profile case. And similarly, bans on assault-style weapons tend not to have any effect or been able to show that there was any effect on gun violence. And then in Washington, D.C., where again for several decades there was a universal registration law that was in place, again showed no impact on homicides in Washington, D.C. And then finally, background checks tend not to affect the purchase of contraband guns, which are those that have been stolen or passed along in one form or another, perhaps after they've been stolen. And given that many gun crimes are committed with those weapons that aren't legally owned, right? They've been stolen because somebody's house was broken into, the gun wasn't locked up, the gun was taken, the gun gets passed along to somebody else, it's used in a crime at some later point in time. So very difficult to control that kind of crime. And then none of the recent, say the last 4 or 5 years, mass shootings in the U.S., and this includes the one in Florida on Saturday night or Sunday morning, would have been prevented by background checks. Right, that the person who was engaged in the shooting in Orlando Saturday night, Sunday morning, was able to legally purchase the guns that were involved in the crime. So while there's oftentimes what many of us have sympathy for that kind of approach, and there are all sorts of ways in which that does make sense, we shouldn't get our hopes up that it will actually do much to cut down on the chances of gun violence. So the question is why? Right, and I think part of it comes back to key pieces of control theory. Right, understand the nature of crime and the individuals who commit those crimes. Right, and criminals are generalists, right? And this is something that at the time of a general theory of crime, when it came out, there was sort of a growing body of evidence that criminals were generalists, and I think in the 20-some-odd years since that book was published, there's now overwhelming evidence that criminals are generalists. So the implication there is that individuals convicted of gun crimes look like every other criminal, right? There isn't some distinguishing characteristic that we can identify in people who use guns and commit crimes that somehow makes them different from everyone else. And then the distribution of gun violence, whether it be social, spatial, temporal, in all sorts of ways mimics the other forms of crime and violence that we have in the United States. Right? Other forms of violence follow the same sort of pattern and distribution that gun violence seems to show. And just briefly, to sort of give a flavor for part of this, thought it would be useful to illustrate what the age distribution of homicides by race and sex looks like in the U.S. And Travis has long been a proponent of nice graphs. One of the dings on some of his work has sometimes been, well, he only used 1 year. Well, so one of the things that we're able to do here is to show what happens with these age distributions over a much longer period of time. So this will cover the period from 1999 to 2014, and the graph will jump around a little bit. So to the extent that statisticians get to animate things, this is really fun for some of us. And so this is total homicides over that period from 1999 to 2014. And as it played through, you saw that it didn't really move around that much. But the couple of things to highlight is that the spike for black males in the U.S. is much more pronounced in the early 20s than it is for the other three groups. White males and black females have age distributions that, by and large, are fairly similar, and then white females have one that's the peak is a little bit more attenuated in the sort of mid to late 20s, approaching 30, and then a much slower decline afterwards. I'll point to the fact that the distribution for white females is really different than what we find with the other ones, and there are reasons for that we may or may not have time to discuss. But if we look at if we break it down by firearm and non-firearm homicides, you see a couple of different patterns, right? And so looking at just firearm homicides by race and sex over time, again, we see that there's not much that shows that there are dramatic shifts over time, right? Things wiggle around a little bit from one year to the next, but it's basically the same pattern that we see in 1999 shows up again, throughout that period, and that we end with in 2014. Interestingly enough, the firearm, or the age distribution of firearm homicides, looks very much like other age distributions of crime, right? Not dramatically different. If we look at non-firearm homicides, we have a very different kind of distribution, right? Something that in lots of ways is bimodal. And prior to starting to work on some of these, I was caught a little bit off guard by the spike early in life. So there's a very high level of infant homicide, right? And I mean, to the degree where it shows up fairly dramatically in non-firearm homicides. I guess it's reassuring that infants aren't being killed by handguns. At the same time, there's a fairly disturbing spike at early in life, and then we have the other curves for the groups. And so over that time period, while that's moving along, the comment I'll make is that not much changes, right? All four of the curves follow very similar sorts of patterns. For the most part, things wiggle around a little bit, but by and large, very much the same pattern over time, with little difference. But the overall structure to the age distribution of non-firearm homicides is different. Right, so it tells us that there is something that's very different about these victims. It doesn't say anything about the offenders in these cases, but the victims are different. And then last two that go through quickly, if we look at just the white males and the curves for firearm and non-firearm homicides, right? So the firearm is the dashed line up on top. Again, the curves stay very much the same over the time period, but the firearm homicide curve, again, looks much more like a typical age crime curve. The victim, or the non-firearm curve, is a lot flatter, again, shows that spike early in life, and then something that's not particularly spiked from the early 20s to the late 50s. And then finally, the black male curve, again, shows that same sort of pattern, fairly dramatic spike for firearm homicides in the early 20s, and then things tail off after that. And so this has all been very much sort of a negative application of control theory. So what might be the positive takeaway from some of this? And I think a really nice example comes from thinking about automobiles, right? So Americans love their guns and their cars, right? And so one of the things that's happened in the U.S., I mean, the auto fatality rates have been declining for decades, but the rate of decline has accelerated in particularly the last 10 to 12 years as more and more cars have airbags as a standard feature to the safety of the car. And within a relatively short period of time, every car sold in the U.S. is required to have airbags. And the benefit to having airbags is that we still have lots and lots of people who won't use a seatbelt, right? But they can still drive like as reckless as they want, and they can get into a fairly serious accident. The airbag is there to prevent them from, some very, very serious forms of injury that might come from an accident. So 20 years ago, these same individuals likely would have died in a crash. Now the airbag, they might still be fairly beat up from the incident, fairly seriously injured, but they're less likely to die from that accident. It'll be decades before every car on the road in the U.S. is equipped with airbags, so it'll be a slow sort of replacement process, but something that we can continue to expect the fatality rates to decline. So if we think about gun violence, right, and one of the points to control theory, something that Travis has commented on many, many times, is that oftentimes simple things that cut down on opportunities are the most effective. Right? You put a lock on your garage door. You put a lock on your bike. It cuts down on the chances that things are stolen, right? In the context of thinking about guns, there's a sort of growing market for smart gun technology, right, which would allow only the owner to fire a particular weapon. So if the weapon was stolen, at least initially, until various technical folks figured out some of the hacks to change it, would make it very difficult for anyone else to use that particular weapon. So, there are these kinds of simple sorts of solutions that at least have the potential to cut down on some of the opportunities for using stolen guns in other kinds of crimes, would prevent infants, or not infants, but kids who, U.S. newspapers love to play these stories up, where some kid picks up their mother's or their father's handgun, thinks it's a toy, and then shoots a sibling, shoots a parent by accident, sometimes with fatal consequences. But then the final point is, to come back to the notion that gun crimes, gun violence, in many ways is no different from other forms of crime. Right? People who commit, the individuals who commit the gun crimes, the criminals, they're just as likely to have committed all sorts of other crimes. Again, if we take the example of the individuals involved in the mass shootings in the U.S. in recent years, none of these individuals have been first-time offenders. Right? If they go on a shooting spree, it's not the first time that something's gone wrong, that there's almost always evidence of some sort of violence, be it domestic violence, be it confrontations with peers or something else. But it's incredibly rare for that shooter to all of a sudden decide to buy several firearms and shoot at a crowd. And so it gets us back to thinking about prevention, right? And that prevention of crime generally is really probably the best prevention for gun crime in the specific, right? That if we target our efforts through families, peers, schools, build development of self-control, self-regulation, whatever it happens to be, in the process of doing that, we'll also work on the prevention of gun crime. So thank you. So it's kind of fun to go long. It's fun to go long.
Barbara's presentation and Chet's reminded me of one of the limits of self-control. In Barbara's study, she found scads of students who never did anything. She therefore couldn't study self-control or any kind of control in that population. So to have control exercised by other people presupposes deviance. And if there's deviance in the group, then that means maybe the controller is also guilty of deviance. So in one sense, you need deviants to control other deviants. An example that Chet mentioned was the shooting in Orlando the other night. I haven't heard any details, and I'm just guessing. But one comment I heard was that the shooting started at 2 in the morning and lasted until 5 a.m. So someone was committing heavily deviant acts for a long period of time. And the implication of this statement was that no one intervened to prevent further homicide, further massacre of innocents. Well, what we learned then is that busybodies have high self-control, and they do not then risk themselves in intervening in deviant acts. Policemen and firemen with excess self-control will not be effective. We need people who are willing to forget themselves to intervene. Those of us who are thinking only of ourselves would be too smart to rush into the burning building or rush into where a massacre is taking place to try to prevent further damage. So we have to think of two segments of the population: those who are thoughtful of the general good rather than their own self, who help prevent crime and deviance by risking intervention. If you've ever tried to intervene in a domestic quarrel, you may have felt some of the consequences. You become the enemy of both parties almost instantly. All right, that's it. We have time for a question or two. If you have a, please. Alfonso.
Thank you very much. Professor Britt has mentioned some of the merits and influence of Professor Hirschi. I think we could even go further. I think it's extremely difficult to talk about criminological theory without taking into account his developments and his ideas. To an important extent, I think he has shaped our contemporary habitus about criminological theory. Both Professor Costello and Britt has brought an interesting issue, that of moral issues. For example, Britt has talked about morality as an internal form of control. Professor Costello has said that their interviewees don't bring very much moral issues, and you have interpreted it as evidence against social learning theories and in favor of control theories. But at the same time, you have mentioned, for example, that some of your interviewees talk about altruistic behavior. So that is the question that I would like to address to the three of you, or maybe just to one of you. This idea of to which extent morality is relevant in control theories, because I think it's most people who have commented, for example, in bone theory, accept that at least beliefs has a certain or an important moral theory, and we could argue that some other elements of the bond have equally a moral element and even self-control. I know you have thought extensively about control theories, and I would like to know about your opinion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that question. So I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently with regard to morality and what Travis called belief in causes of delinquency and what other people call moral values and so on is empirically, they're incredibly strongly related to measures of self-control. I know in some analyses I've seen it's difficult to include both self-control indexes and measures of belief or moral values or whatever you want to call them in the same regression analysis because they're so highly correlated with each other. And so the question that I have, and I don't really have an answer to this question, but something I've been thinking a lot about lately is, what exactly are moral beliefs? I mean, we know that we can measure them, and we know that they're very strongly correlated with deviance, and they're also strongly correlated with self-control in the direction that we would expect. And so what I've been thinking a lot about is maybe beliefs or moral values and self-control are all measuring the same thing, and that same thing is the outcome of the socialization process, right? So if self-control is a product largely of early childhood socialization, we don't have our biology guy here today to contradict me in saying that. So if we assume that, then you could look at self-control and social control and measures of moral beliefs as simply being outcomes of a successful socialization process. So that's kind of how I've been thinking about it. I mean, there's no denying that measures of values and beliefs related to criminal behavior are very strongly correlated with it. But I look at that, and then I sort of look at the outcome of my study, and it doesn't seem like these things are really salient in terms of what my respondents were reporting. And, granted, a lot of my data are asking about often students are telling me about fairly minor deviant behaviors, but some of them are pretty serious. We talk about drinking and driving, and there were a couple of cases in our data of friends talking other friends out of committing suicide and really serious stuff like that. It doesn't seem that values are really salient to people in that way. So I guess my question, it's not really answering your question, but that's something that I've been thinking about a lot is, I don't know that we've spent enough time as a discipline thinking about what moral values are, and are they really separate from self-control?
You've just heard my lecture for tomorrow. As a matter of fact, I say that moral values, following your thinking, moral values are our collective estimates of the negative consequences of particular lines of behavior, and they add not much to that estimate. They codify it, but they are based on experience that these kinds of things lead to dire consequences for most people in the long run. And therefore, they are excellent predictors because people have internalized the view that these things you shouldn't do are things you shouldn't do because you will regret it if you do it. So, thank you. And I'm sorry, Alfonso. I'm sure I didn't respond to you. Yes, young man.
So I have a question for Chet about policy control. So I think the United States is probably going to a way where everyone's going to go through metal detectors. I mean, our whole society will walk through metal detectors all the time. Is that going to control gun crime?
Probably not. I think, the metal detectors only go so far, and I don't know that the positives of having metal detectors everywhere would sort of outweigh the negatives of just having to deal with that. And I mean, it doesn't answer the question directly, but a number of us have witnessed or read about or heard about situations where you have people who show up to the security screening at the airport and they stick their bag on the conveyor belt to go through the machine, and then the security folks, the TSA folks, shut everything down because they just found a handgun in somebody's bag. And somebody goes, "Oh yeah, I forgot it was there." And I think, it just gets at the idea that guns are just so common in certain parts of the country that people don't think twice about it. It's just, they stick their wallet in their pocket, or, they grab their purse and they grab their gun. And, that's not likely to change for fairly broad swaths of the population. And simultaneously, I think, the political system is such that, in a number of states, I think Arizona's one of them. There have actually been fairly significant pushes to, to do away with rules about bringing firearms into other areas where they'd historically been prohibited. So, now we have a number of states that have laws that allow students to bring weapons onto campus. There are laws that now, or certain towns, whatever, where City Hall had been sort of a safe zone, where there had been a metal detector. For other reasons, they say, no, we need to do away with that and allow people to bring their weapons into the courts, to City Hall, or wherever it happens to be. And in some ways, it strikes many of us as just a really bizarre way to go about living in the world. But I think partly it reflects the sort of political, social pieces to the thinking about the kind of behavior, too. So, yeah, I wouldn't anticipate metal detectors if sort of the current political context in the U.S. is any gauge. We'll probably actually have more of those removed over the next several years than we've had installed. It doesn't give me a lot of comfort, right? But it seems to be the direction.
Yes.
Hi.
That was here in my state of North Carolina yesterday. They were supposed to propose to do away with concealed weapon permits in lieu of people being able to carry a concealed weapon without a permit, which is just the latest iteration of first it was open carry without a permit, and now it's concealed carry without a permit. And I'd like actually yours and Barbara's both comments on the ongoing for the last 5 to 10 years in the United States of a fairly dramatic, I think, natural experiment in access to guns and a sort of a pure effect to carry guns on non-criminals, so to speak, and what you think that might pose in terms of future homicide and gun violence deaths in the United States.
So, I mean, I don't know that the research has caught up with a lot of the changes, but there are lots of opportunities now to start to sort of more systematically collect some of that information. In some of the evidence that I'm more familiar with, one of the things that comes out of that is that regardless of changes in the law, there were a lot of people who were already carrying. And, in talking to, so I've been at 2 different universities over the last couple of years, and in talking to the officers on both of those university campuses, and asking them about, as these laws were going into effect or being considered in different states to allow students to bring weapons onto campus, the response was, well, students already carry weapons on campus. And all this will do is just sort of formalize what students have already been doing. And so I guess so one of the questions that comes to my mind, not being able to sort of answer directly the question that you have, is that I don't know that we have good evidence sort of at a very broad or large scale that would tell us what sort of concealed carry people have already been doing that hasn't been with a permit or legal. And then once, say, like North Carolina changes its law, is the behavior actually going to change, or is it just sort of status quo? And so I think that's where there's some really interesting research questions to get at. So if we don't see a change in other kinds of outcomes, perhaps it was due to the fact that people's behavior didn't change, or it did. It's I think just a fascinating question that I don't have a real good handle on the sense at this point. I don't know if
one thing we do know about gun control in the United States is that if you mention the word, sales of guns skyrocket. Yeah. So since scholars became interested in gun control in the 60s, hundreds of millions of weapons have been sold, many of them traceable to the interest of academics or legal people in controlling guns. So we're not very good at, we're too good at maybe telescoping our interest in taking people's guns away. They move to assure themselves that they'll have one when you come around.
Right, and I think, I guess to build off of that comment, I think there's actually pretty good evidence now. Most of it, shows up in the popular press, but every time there's a mass shooting and the president comes out and says, we need background checks, we need better control or regulation of weapons, then gun stores sell out of everything in relatively short order because people are concerned that the laws will go into effect and make it impossible for them to purchase guns. And so because of the number of high-profile shootings, mass-scale shootings that we've had, right, the number of guns that have been sold in the last 5 years in particular has just skyrocketed. And I don't think that there's been a corresponding increase in gun violence, that sort of matches the spike in gun purchases. It's an interesting set of conditions. I mean, lots and lots of opportunity, and the fact that most gun owners don't commit crimes with their guns, right? I mean, it's the same kind of sort of generality that we can make about kids. Most kids turn out to be just fine, but there's a small group that's a problem. So I don't.
Yeah. So the way.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. That's what I was, going to comment on. It seems to me that, and I'm stealing this from Marcus Felsen, basically, that the best predictor of what people are going to do is opportunity. Make something easy. The easier we make something, the more likely people are to do it, no matter what it is. I think, and I think it's hard to come up with exceptions to that. And then there's the issue of self-selection, right? So who's running out and buying those guns? Is it people who already own guns, and so the opportunity for using them either, to kill a mass shooter or, in a criminal way, maybe it isn't actually changing at all because we don't know who's going out and buying them. And I think, it's not an issue I know a lot about in terms of changes in people's behavior about buying guns, but I'm guessing it's probably not people like me who are going out and buying guns, and it may actually be people who already own them. But I would also expect, it's an interesting question because I would expect that more guns available would mean more opportunity for both kinds of gun use, and by both kinds I mean criminal gun use, and also the pro-gun people in the U.S. are constantly drawing out anecdotal evidence. There was a bad guy and a good guy happened to have a gun and shot him, but it's all anecdotal. So we don't really know how often that, or at least I don't know how often that happens. And but I would expect that both of those kinds of shootings would probably increase to some extent as, I don't know, I mean, we already have one for everyone in the country, but so, I mean, in general, I would say it's a bad thing, but on the other hand, I'm not sure who it is who are going out and buying more guns, and it may be people who already own them.
Another question. Yes.
So I have 2 points. One, I maybe can kind of represent what the bio people might say about morality, because as you were talking about beliefs and the influence there and differences in populations, that's a very emotion-based thinking and involves an emotional response, and there certainly are associations between biological risk factors and how emotion influences thinking and how sensitive we are to different things in terms of things that disgust us or initiate fear and things like that. So I think that probably would have been something Matt talked quite a bit about. But my other point is we come back again and again, and 3 years ago I was sitting at this conference and hearing the same thing, and it's a little frustrating. We have really excellent economical ways of intervening with families at a primary level to teach basic information about emotion, learning theory. It has its place. And parenting, and doing it in group settings that would involve bigger networks and social influences and control. And at least in the United States, they get no traction. They can't happen. And I think part of it, you guys made a good point about, is it's still a very small population of people have an immediate, pressing, significant need for it. And yet, if we made it more of the expected normative way of behaving, of learning about child development and influencing child behavior, and everybody talked about it, wouldn't that make a huge difference? How do we get more traction?
Want to try that?
Well, I mean, I think that the
You
short
asked an
answer.
easier question.
Well, I think the short answer
Do you
is
know that woman?
she's always difficult. Yeah, would be yes. I mean, they in principle, the program should have an effect, but the ability of scale, how you. So then the question is, how do you get parents into some kind of training session? And right, because the way the world seems to work is it takes more education to get a driver's license than it does to be a parent, right? And so, but being a parent is way more complicated than driving a car. And so how you get people to do that is something Travis is going to talk about right now.
Right now. Manuel Eisner has a recent piece, and I think one of the major journals, a long one. One of the tables I looked at the other day showed that the more book sales there are, the lower the crime rate, historically. So the suggestion is that the more information we have about everything, the more civilized we are, the less likely we are to commit criminal acts. So our society has been doing very well at civilizing itself historically by increasing the amount of information. I grant I think your principle that we don't like to talk about these things at the lowest level, but we get there indirectly by making people aware of a larger world and a larger context. All right, time's up. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks for coming.